Sup, chooms? So I am pleased to announce that it is time yet again for the Haircafe Game of the Year Awards, where I as a gamer will look back at all the glorious experiences I had playing video games in the year 2024, and then I will make the very important decision on which video game was the best overall. So, just like last year, what I'll be doing is that I'll pick the 5 runner-ups before declaring the ultimate winner, and just like last year, there will be no spoilers in any of these reviews. Now, I'm no Jeff Keighley, and since this is a hair loss channel, I know not nearly as many people are going to care about my opinions on video games, but I know some of you guys liked the show last year, and for those who did, I really appreciate that. For those who don't care though, don't worry, this is just an annual tradition on this channel, and we'll be back to fighting the slaphead curse soon enough. So, before I go over the 5 runner-ups, let me first go over some popular, critically acclaimed games this year that still did not make the list this year, and I'll go ahead and explain why. The first is the game Metaphor ReFantazio. Now, I've heard a lot of great things about this game. It even managed to get a very elusive 10 out of 10 score from GameSpot.com, and pretty much every professional and amateur review has lauded the game as one of the best JRPGs ever made, and even though I was tempted to check it out just because of the sheer positive critical reception, I ultimately decided to pass on it, and I'll go ahead and explain why. Well, first of all, just look at this. Look at this art style. I'm sorry guys, but this just isn't for me. I know the game is made by the same people who brought us the Persona series, and I did play some of the older Persona games back in the day on the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2. I believe the last one I played was Persona 3, but as I've gotten older, I have to admit that my tolerance for certain anime tropes and cliches and anime art style has really dwindled over the years. It all just looks too samey looking and derivative, at least with modern anime. Older anime like Gundam, Macross, Area 88, and Fist of the North Star all look way better to me than modern anime. If you were to show me this game's characters next to 99% of any other game's characters with an anime art style like BlazBlue, Guilty Gear, or Xenoblade, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference, quite honestly. The characters of these games look way too clean. There's no grit at all. Why don't they have any texture? They all look like children's action figures or dolls. Also, what's up with these costumes here, where all the guys are wearing these oversized coats, even indoors, and the girls are all dressed up in animal costumes? It looks way too random and arbitrary for me. These look like cheap Halloween costumes you can buy online from an anime shop. If I were living in some fantasy setting, I wouldn't want to dress like this. I'd rather walk around looking like this. If you were to show me this art and I had no prior knowledge, then I would swear to you that I've seen it somewhere before, because it just looks like every other generic anime or anime game I've seen a million times before already, and I find it highly unappealing. Now, before you weebs get angry at me, I actually do like anime, and there are some anime art styles that look genuinely good to me and stand out in a good way, like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and Berserk, but most video games that use anime art style these days all look exactly the same to me, and frankly, I just find it very boring to look at. So, I'm sorry if that offends you, but that's just my opinion. So, I'm sure Metaphor ReFantazio is a fantastic game objectively, but it's just not for me. So, the second game that won't be featured is Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, and that is just because I haven't played it yet. I wish I had, because I really would have liked to include a Nintendo game on this list. I know I didn't last year, so I really would have liked to this year, but I was just too backlogged, and when I have a backlog, I usually don't prioritize Nintendo games, since Nintendo games aren't as story-driven, and therefore I'm not as worried about spoilers. When a story-driven game comes out though, like let's say God of War Ragnarok, I feel I have to beat it and rush through it as soon as possible, otherwise YouTube will start recommending videos in their algorithms that have thumbnails and titles that completely ruin the game for me. Like for example, that's why I never played Red Dead Redemption 2, because just one glance at a thumbnail several years ago completely ruined the game's story for me, and I've had no desire to play it ever since, even though everybody tells me it's an amazing game. I just can't play it though, because I'll get these brain goblins that remind me of the spoiler, and it'll make the game completely unenjoyable. But when it comes to Nintendo games though, I don't typically play the games for the story, so I don't really care as much. So, okay. Now let's go ahead and talk about the third game that won't be making the list, and that is the game Stellar Blade. Now, don't get me wrong, I actually like this game. The graphics and music are both incredible. The protagonist, Eve, is fan-servicey as hell, but she definitely fits in well with the setting, and she is undoubtedly one of the most attractive video game waifus I have ever seen. But even though this is a good game that I recommend to a lot of people, I think it is still held back from greatness by some questionable gameplay decisions. I feel the combat is good, but I found it unsatisfying. You see, the way way the gameplay works is that the enemies of the game have a separate meter below their health called a balance or stability meter, and the way you lower it is by successfully countering their attacks with perfect blocks. When you manage to fully deplete their balance meter, you will get a prompt to perform a retribution attack where Eve will do this really cool animation that does a larger amount of damage, and you can do this with pretty much every enemy in the game, including boss fights. But the big problem with these retribution attacks, though, is that they're extremely unrewarding with boss fights, and this is a Souls-like game, so boss fights are where it's at, but it takes like 10 or more successful counters in order to perform a retribution attack, and the retribution attack really doesn't do all that much damage to bosses. It's much easier to just play the game by buying a bunch of health regenerating consumables and bashing the bosses to death with your sword while occasionally dodging, so I feel the game encouraged me to play it in a way that I didn't really want to play it as, since actually trying to take down the bosses in style is way harder, takes way longer, it doesn't feel particularly rewarding when you can easily just exploit the other game's mechanics to cheese through the bosses. There are also moments of the game that deliberately handicap you, like I remember this one part where you actually lose access to your sword and you have to rely on your gun. The problem here is that Stellar Blade is not a shooting game and the gunplay isn't nearly as fun as the swordplay, so it makes this particular segment way less fun and it goes on for way too long. Also, the game has too many boring side quests which pad out the game's length, which is probably why I didn't finish it. Overall though, it is still a good game, and I think they may make a sequel and it will probably be a masterpiece, but I don't think Stellar Blade is a Game of the Year material. It doesn't even deserve to be in the runner-up, so I'd probably give it a 6.5 out of 10. So it's fun, but it's definitely not worthy to be in the runner-ups this year. So, the next up, and this one breaks my heart to have to admit, is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Final Fantasy VII is one of my favorite JRPGs of all time, and as someone who was a huge fan of the 2020 remake, which I thought was done excellently, I was very excited about continuing Cloud's quest in this year's follow-up, and even though I thought it was a good game, it had some major issues that kept it from greatness. So the first major problem here is the graphics. If you're playing on the PlayStation 5, then just like with most games these days, you have the option to toggle either a performance or a cinematic mode. It looks great in cinematic mode, but sadly the frame rate is really choppy, often dropping well below 30 frames per second. In performance mode, the frame rate manages a fairly consistent 50 to 60 frames per second, which is great, but sadly it comes at the cost of the game's visual fidelity and visual consistency as well. The character models do look great, but some of the textures look like they came from a Sega Dreamcast game in the environment. Fortunately, the game has recently been given a visual overhaul for the PlayStation 5 Pro, and it is also scheduled to get a release on the PC next month, so those visual issues have been largely addressed, but for people who played the game when it was new or don't have access to the right hardware, it was a real shame that the game had so many visual blemishes when it first launched. The game has also a lot of embellishment in it, with some of it being good and some of it being bad. The new stuff they added to the Golden Saucer and Junon segment of the game, like the Junon Parade, I thought that was all excellent, and also the card minigame Queen's Blood in particular is one of my favorites of all time. It isn't as good as Gwent from The Witcher 3, of course, but let's face it, nothing is as good as Gwent. It was still fun though, and it's definitely better than that boring Machine Strike minigame in Horizon 2 that nobody played. There are also a lot of tedious MMORPG-style fetch quests that make some parts of the game feel like a slog, like the jungles of Gungaga and the Temple of the Ancients, but this is a pretty common problem with most games these days, so I don't make too big of a fuss about it, and to be fair, I actually liked most of the new stuff, and overall, I genuinely enjoyed my time enough that I would have strongly considered putting this game on my Game of the Year list, but sadly, the ending of the game completely ruined it for me. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's ending is perhaps the most disappointing, convoluted, and downright terrible ending I have seen in a video game since Mass Effect 3 and Assassin's Creed 3's ending. Rebirth is the second game in a planned trilogy for the Final Fantasy VII Remake project, so it is still possible that this game's ending could be salvaged by really good writing in the third installment, but I felt really let down by Rebirth's ending, especially since they took away a very emotionally powerful moment from the original game that probably contributed to the overprescription of Ritalin in teenagers in the 1990s, and I think a lot of you chooms who are gamers know what I'm talking about, but I'm not going to say what it is, because I did promise to make these reviews spoiler-free, but this particular moment I am referring to, I think was a very important turning point that contributed to Cloud's development as a character. It was a turning point where Cloud finally ceased being an arrogant, cocky mercenary who is unconcerned about the greater good, and he transformed into the selfless hero and great leader who wants to save the world. I don't know what kind of introspection Cloud will have about his character in light of these radically different events in Rebirth compared to the original game, but I don't like this new direction. It is possible that really good writing in the third installment will redeem things, but as things stand right now, the ending in Rebirth has made me less excited for Part 3, and that is why Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will not be in my Game of the Year list. Lastly, I have to mention Dragon's Dogma 2. I played about 5 hours of this game and I liked what I played of it, but I decided I'm going to replay it at a later date just because it runs kind of poorly on the base PlayStation 5, so I'm going to replay it on my PlayStation 5 Pro sometime next year. Alright, so even though there were a lot of prominent titles this year, there can be only one game that gets the Haircafe Game of the Year award, so let's go over the 5 runner-ups. Runner-up number 5, Silent Hill 2 Remake. Now, I've played a lot of horror games, and the original Silent Hill 2 on the PlayStation 2 is one of my favorite horror games of all time, and I'm happy to report that this remake by Bloober Team and Konami does not disappoint in the slightest. I think what makes Silent Hill 2 work so well as a horror game is how the game communicates with you emotionally. The game's narrative is deliberately vague and open to interpretation, which really works well in this game's favor, because you never know what to fully make out of what you see or what you're hearing in the game, and it can make otherwise banal moments of the game seem much more disturbing than they should be. Like, there is a scene where a character named Eddie is sitting in a dark movie theater, and he's eating something out of a popcorn bucket, but based on the sound of his chewing, you get the feeling that it definitely isn't popcorn. Or there's this other character named Maria who is an attractive woman who is quite flirty with the main protagonist, but when you consider the situation the characters are in, you can't help but suspect that something is off with someone acting so casually and flirtatious, considering that their lives are in such great danger, considering that they're in this hellish environment. The game doesn't have that many jump scares, except for the mannequin enemies, since those jump out at you when you least expect it, but throughout the game, even during the slow parts, you get this lingering feeling of dread, and none of it feels scripted or forced. The game doesn't even have that many cutscenes, and most of the scares happen so subtly that I wouldn't be surprised if I missed some of them. Like, for example, I remember I was in the morgue with a bunch of bodies, and I swear, I think I saw this from the corner of my eye, but I saw one of the bodies briefly move for just a brief fleeting moment. It didn't actually lead to anything or put me in danger, but it almost made me feel like the game was toying with me. The game's sound is a similar story. Headphones are a must if you really want to enjoy this game to the fullest. So there's not much music, most of what you hear is just ambience, but there are still things I heard in the game that I cannot make any sense of, even after I've reflected on it for several months after playing it. For instance, I remember I was in the prison level, and there's this courtyard at the bottom of the prison with a weight puzzle in the center of it, and it's so dark that you can barely see in front of your face, which feels especially uneasy since the area is huge. But if you listen really closely, you can hear what almost sounds like a horse galloping in the background. I never figured out what it was, and that's probably what made it so creepy for me, because there is fear in the unknown. What I see and hear in the game is often beyond my understanding, and that's what makes it so damn unsettling to me. If I were to describe the game's atmosphere, it feels like a quiet and cold version of hell. There's also moments of the game that are more directly frightening. I'm sure anyone who has heard of Silent Hill has heard of Pyramid Head, who is the antagonist who stalks you throughout the game. A lot of his appearances are scripted since he is a recurring boss fight, but many of them actually aren't. Like, I remember late in the game, there was one point where I saw him just randomly run after me, so of course I ran away, and I ended up going through a few doors thinking I lost him, so I thought I was safe. So I went ahead and proceeded with the game. I went down a ladder, but then I thought maybe I missed some ammunition, so I backtracked by climbing up the ladder, and behind the metal grate was Pyramid Head, who was just standing there creepily facing me, which made me realize that he was still chasing me this entire time, even when I thought I was in the clear. And I have to tell you, chums, there's something especially disturbing about thinking you were safe when in reality you were almost killed. I was never safe. I just thought I was, and the fact that the game let me think that is why I love the game so much. It tricks you, it toys with you. So, Silent Hill 2 is definitely not without its faults. I mean, there are too many zombies, especially early in the game, and fighting them just becomes a bit too tedious and ammo consuming. Also, some of the enemies are just flat out annoying, like those monkey looking monsters that climb on the metal grates where if you shoot them, they just climb back up, but you end up burning through most of your ammo without realizing it. But what makes Silent Hill 2 so amazing is I actually felt more in danger when I was not fighting enemies compared to when I was in combat, but that's just because the atmosphere itself is the most terrifying enemy in the game, and that is what makes Silent Hill 2 work so so spectacularly as a survival horror game. I heard it got a PS5 Pro patch recently, so I think I am going to replay it, because the game has about 8 endings which are determined based on your choices in the game, and this game takes about 20 hours to beat the first time, so there is definitely a lot of spooky entertainment to be had out of this game. So definitely pick this one up if you haven't yet and you like horror games. Alright, so that's the 5th runner-up. What about number 4? Number 4 is Dragon Age The Veilguard. Now, I know what you're all thinking, but Kevin, that game is too woke. The woke mind virus has taken over your brain. Fuck you, you liberal. Well, to everyone saying that, I say it is time to get the fuck over it. We've been hearing non-stop about how everything is woke since 2014, and it's getting really tiresome seeing everybody get so easily offended by the most trivial things. Not every game has to pander to your political beliefs in order for it to be enjoyable, and if that makes it impossible for you to actually enjoy a game, then perhaps you need to consider a new hobby. So if you've played Dragon Age Origins or any of the following games in the Dragon Age series, or just any BioWare game in general, then you all must know by now that cheesy lines have always been there. It's not bad, it's just part of the charm. BioWare games have also always been popular with women too. I believe BioWare showed player statistics for the Mass Effect series once, and they showed actually that more people played as a female Shepard instead of a dude Shepard, which is surprising. So yes, I'll admit that some of the storyline and writing is a bit cringe. In fact, a lot of it is very cringe, but the characters and the atmosphere more than make up for it in my opinion. I can't say too much about the plot for this one because my girlfriend is still in the process of beating the game, and she would kill me for spoiling it since she does watch these videos, but to briefly address why this game has been so controversial, it's because there is a trans or non-binary character in it, and the game also gives you the option to be transgendered yourself. It does admittedly seem a bit out of place for a game with a fantasy setting. It makes more sense for a game like Cyberpunk 2077, because by the year 2077, I doubt anyone's still going to care if anyone's transgender. But Dragon Age's setting is a parallel of the European Dark Ages, so it takes a while to get used to seeing things like modern-day gender pronouns used in a medieval fantasy setting. But then again, we're also talking about a game that has Kunari, elves, and evil elven gods who are using dragons to conquer the world, so maybe it's not all that far-fetched. But you know what? I have nothing against people who are transgendered or non-binary, but even if I did, I would still be able to enjoy this game. I know that people like that exist in real life, and many of them like to play video games too, and being that Dragon Age The Veilguard is a role-playing game, a lot of gamers like to imagine themselves as being the hero of the story. I think it is actually a positive that BioWare is giving us more options in how we customize our character. It's not intrusive in the slightest. It's not forced on anyone. If you want to play as a straight white male character, you can do just that, and I know that because that's exactly what I did when I played the game, and I am not so easily offended that I let the mere existence of another character who doesn't fit that archetype ruin the game for me. Also, if you know BioWare games, then you should know that you're not necessarily even supposed to like all of your companions. The non-binary character in question is someone you don't even have to bring along in your party, and without saying too much, if you really hate them, you can even get them killed if you want to. So that way, everybody is going to be happy, whether you're a woke SJW cuck or a Kekistan neck-bearded man-child. The point is here, chums, is that you shouldn't let your political views get in the way of you enjoying this game, because it is a great game, and probably BioWare's best title since Mass Effect 2. And I bring up Mass Effect 2 specifically because Veilguard brings back what I think was the best moment in any BioWare game ever, the suicide mission. I'm not going to say too much, but BioWare is a company that isn't afraid to break your heart and kill off major characters based on the choices you make in the game, and that is what the suicide mission is all about. It's a final moment of the game where you're up against seemingly impossible odds, and you're forced to make decisions where companions can and will get killed. Who lives and who dies isn't just based on the decisions you make at the end of the game, but also the decisions you made throughout the course of the game. So, the suicide mission lets you feel the weight of all the subsequent actions you made in the game, which makes everything you did, including the side quests, feel completely relevant. So, even if you are playing Dragon Age Veilguard and you aren't enjoying it all that much right now, I still strongly encourage you to push through, because the last 3 hours of the game is some of the best I have ever seen in any video game, period. In fact, I'd say that the suicide mission in Dragon Age Veilguard is even better than the suicide mission in Mass Effect 2, since you don't have to just build up loyalty with your companions to ensure the best outcome, you also have to build up trust with various factions throughout the game who will help you in the final mission, and it plays out spectacularly because you feel that you've rallied the entire world behind your cause by the end of the game, and everybody feels like they play an important part. It isn't like in Mass Effect 2 where you have some companions that that feel pretty much worthless, like Morden or Thane, who pretty much always get killed even if they're loyal. So this game is worth it for the suicide mission alone. The suicide mission in Mass Effect 2 was so amazing that I'm surprised we haven't seen similar concepts like it implemented in other games. The only other game I could think of that actually has done it is Witcher 3 during the Battle of Kaer Morhen, but that happened in the middle of the game, so the stakes weren't quite as high, but that part of the game was still incredible, possibly my favorite in the entire game. But the suicide mission in Veilguard is the best I have ever seen, and I really hope we see it again in future titles, including the next Mass Effect game, which is hopefully coming soon. Outside of the suicide mission though, BioWare has returned to their roots by ditching the open world style game we saw in Dragon Age Inquisition and Mass Effect Andromeda, and they have returned to making semi-linear hub areas. It's a huge improvement as there are far fewer repetitive MMORPG style fetch quests, and the side quests feel much more meaningful, especially since they affect the outcome of the suicide mission at the end of the game. So, whatever your opinion is about the woke stuff, I encourage you to put it aside because the game is still definitely worth it. BioWare has proven that they're still one of the best developers of Western RPGs, and Veilguard is easily the best Dragon Age game in the series since Origins. I'm not sure if I think it is better than Origins because Origins is one of the best games ever made, but it is definitely better than Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition, the latter game which I didn't really like much at all because as much as I like BioWare, they just don't know how to do open world games. Witcher 3 came out just a few months after Dragon Age Inquisition, and the open world was so much better in Witcher 3 that it made Inquisition look like a complete joke. I mean, just compare the city of Val Royeaux in Inquisition to Novigrad in Witcher 3, and you'll know what I'm talking about. So, open world is definitely not BioWare's forte. They do much better with semi-linear hub areas, and that's why I'm delighted they're resting on their laurels this time and doing what they do best. So, it's been a long hiatus, but I think BioWare is officially back, and I can't wait to see the next Mass Effect game or whatever else BioWare is planning. So let's move on to the third runner-up. Number 3, Legacy of Kain 1 and 2 Remaster. Two amazing games for the price of one. These games are the sequel to Legacy of Kain Blood Omen, which came out on the PlayStation back in 1996, and I remember video game magazines at the time described it as an R-rated Legend of Zelda game. I liked it, but the Soul Reaver games were always my favorites. First, let's talk about the graphics. These remasters look incredible. The visuals on the original game have aged especially well due to their inspired art direction, but the technical limitations of early consoles resulted in blocky, pixelated characters that require a lot of imagination to still appreciate today. That's all been changed now, though, with newer, higher resolution textures and greatly improved polygon count. Raziel, the main character, is so detailed you could see each individual rib, and it's remarkable that despite being over 1,500 years old, he still has a Norwood 1 hairline. Now, I'll admit that it's possible that younger Gen Z gamers may not be able to appreciate this package as much as gamers from my generation can. I myself was a young man when these games came out back in 1999 and 2001, and being that these remasters are faithful to the original release, there are a lot of modern-day quality of life comforts modern gamers are accustomed to that they will not find in these two classic titles. There are no map markers, there are no waypoints that always tell you where to go, and there's not even a map. So there is definitely no hand-holding here. All you get are occasional hints from other characters about where to explore. This is a game that expects you to be patient and intelligent enough to figure out on your own all of its secrets. The reason why you don't see games with this kind of template anymore very often is because, quite frankly, it wouldn't work well in most modern games. Most games these days are far too big and uninteresting, so without a map and waypoints, you'd be completely screwed because as vast as these worlds may be, nothing in them is interesting enough to be memorable, so gamers will quickly forget about their surroundings once they've left them. What this ultimately results in are games that have these absolutely beautiful and vast worlds that we end up barely even looking at because as we traverse them, we spend most of our time just looking at a little dot on a waypoint while navigating a map. Legacy of Kain, though, is completely different. You don't need a map here because every explorable area is memorable, and even if you do get lost, it's okay because often getting lost leads to the discovery of interesting new areas where you can discover power-ups and new spells that make the effort feel rewarding. The game feels vast without actually being that big because each area in the game is densely packed with secrets. So every time you're on your way to your next objective and you stumble across another path, you know it's worth exploring. And even if you go there and find a dead end, you'll still remember the area and the particular obstacle that prevented you from progressing. So later on when you acquire a new ability that lets you circumvent the obstacle you saw earlier, you'll be excited to return to the area and you'll still feel like it was rewarding to have discovered earlier, even though at the time you couldn't progress since now now you know exactly where to go, and you're curious about what secrets you'll uncover in this game's fascinating world. What also makes the game feel a lot bigger than it really is that Raziel, the game's protagonist, has the ability to phase shift to another dimension. This often changes the geometry of the environment, opening up new areas and new secrets. The game setting of Nosgoth is genuinely one of the most interesting and unique I have ever seen in any video game. Nosgoth is an analog of medieval Europe, typical to many fantasy games, but due to the events in the first game, Legacy of Kain Blood Omen, the world of Nosgoth experienced over 1,000 years of decay and destruction, so much so that the world has become completely unrecognizable from what we remembered from the first game. The game is well written and voiced by actual talented voice actors, which, believe it or not, was a rarity back then. This game came out just 3 years after the original Resident Evil, keep in mind.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
The plot is a basic tale of revenge, but while playing the game, you're given subtle hints that the people around you aren't to be trusted, and that there's a lot more to the story that you're not being told. A lot of this is revealed eventually in Soul Reaver 2, which is a direct sequel that picks up immediately after the first game. Soul Reaver 2 is a more streamlined experience compared to its predecessor, but it continues the game's excellent storytelling and writing. There's less exploration and fewer puzzles, and there is a greater emphasis on combat, which hasn't aged very well, so between the two, I definitely prefer the original Soul Reaver, but Soul Reaver 2 is still good to have in this package, and it is a solid game in its own right. Not everything in the game has aged very well. I mentioned the combat, which is dated, but also there are some boring puzzles which involve pushing blocks around, which was common for games of its era like Tomb Raider, but they don't do enough to really detract from the game's overall positive experience, so Soul Reaver is definitely one of my favorite games of all time, and it is great to experience it all over again with a fresh coat of paint. I just hope that we get remastered versions of Blood Omen 2 and Legacy of Kain Defiance very soon, especially since Soul Reaver 2 ends on a cliffhanger. So let's move on to follow-up number 2. Follow-up number 2 is Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. Now, I'll be perfectly honest, I am not a die-hard Warhammer fan. I know it's been around forever because I remember the first time I heard about it was when I was 15 years old and I was visiting Scotland, so that was nearly 30 years ago. I was visiting a Warhammer shop where I was introduced to the tabletop game, although I don't think it was Warhammer 40k. I think it was just regular Warhammer, which is the fantasy counterpart to Warhammer 40k. So even though I definitely enjoyed the tabletop game, I never really got into the franchise, and I guess that's because I found it a bit intimidating with just how vast and bloated it is. I've heard there are over 300 books alone, so I felt that the franchise was just so big that I didn't even really know where I'd need to begin in order to become a proper Warhammer 40k fan. Let me tell you though, after playing through Space Marine 2, even as someone with just a cursory understanding of Warhammer 40k's lore and setting, Space Marine 2 is a ridiculously fun game and it is worth every single penny. I heard a critic once describe it as an Xbox 360 style third-person shooter on modern consoles, but the truth is, it's even better than that, because this game manages to be both a fun shooter as well as a fun hack-and-slash style game at the same time. So, in the game, you have both ranged weapons like machine guns and plasma pistols, and you also have a melee weapon like a dagger or a chainsword, which is literally a hybrid between a sword and a chainsaw. The way the game works is that you'll have these absolutely massive waves of enemies like the Tyranids who will swarm you and your companions. The sheer quantity of the enemies is so vast that it looks like they go on for miles, but they go down very easily with just 1 or 2 shots from your firearms, and the firearms all feel fantastic. The sound effects make every shot feel powerful, and there's some nice subtle touches like when you hold down the trigger button to aim, you can press the R3 button in order to zoom in just a little further, which is really useful for the enemies that can shoot you at a distance. But if you do get overrun, you don't have to run away and find cover like you do in most third-person games. You just take out your chainsword or whatever other melee weapon you're using, and the game becomes an extremely competent hack and slash that's complete with combos and input delayed attacks that allow you to do area of effect attacks on smaller enemies, as well as combos to focus on larger and stronger enemies. With larger enemies, you can even do stylish execution attacks that don't just look cool, but they also replenish your shields, which encourages you to play the game aggressively rather than constantly running away and waiting for your health to replenish, which is very common with a lot of these cover-based shooters that we remember from the Xbox 360 era. The graphics are some of the best seen on the PlayStation 5, and if you happen to have a PlayStation 5 Pro like I do, then you're in for a real visual treat. The game is definitely a showpiece title to show off your powerful hardware, and I can only imagine how good it looks for the PC Master Race. The game has an old school feel to it in a good way. It has an interesting plot with most of the exposition being told between levels on the ship, but the game never tries to be anything more than just a fun game. So the plot definitely doesn't overstay its welcome, and neither does this game, which focuses on quality over quantity. That's why the campaign is like 13-14 hours long. There are some other features to extend the game's lifespan, like it has a multiplayer mode that includes PvP and a co-op, which I haven't even touched yet admittedly, but even having finished the main campaign, I am definitely eager to play through it again on a harder difficulty. I played through it on Veteran, and I believe there's one more difficulty above that, so I am definitely excited to give it another go, and if you are playing the game for the first time, I do encourage you to play it on a difficulty level that's higher than you normally play it on, because the challenge definitely adds to the fun factor. But definitely give this game a go if you haven't already, and if you have friends who can play it with you cooperatively, that's even better. But even as just a purely single player experience, this is one of the best action games this generation. So finally, let's get to the final runner-up before I announce the Haircafe Game of the Year award. The number one runner-up is Helldivers 2, also known as Hairdivers 2. So I have a confession. I am not a huge multiplayer gamer. I don't play a lot of multiplayer games. But when I heard this game was heavily inspired by Starship Troopers, which is one of my favorite sci-fi films of all time, I knew I had to check it out. And indeed, the inspiration is definitely there. It takes place in a distant future where humanity is governed by a one-world jingoistic military government called Super Earth that is waging a galactic war against what they call the enemies of freedom and managed democracy. The enemies include the bug-like Terminids, as well as the mechanical automatrons, who have a lot of socialist allegory in their depictions, like being red, as well as using a Marxist star as their symbol. So even though the player is exposed to a barrage of propaganda extolling the virtues of liberty, freedom, and democracy, it's obvious that these are all just meaningless buzzwords to obfuscate the fact that the government and society of Super Earth are in fact not democratic at all, but rather they are a fascist and highly imperialist regime that is trying to use the facade of freedom and liberty in order to galvanize its people behind an authoritarian regime. So, even though this game doesn't have a real deep plot or even a story campaign, the setting makes all the rallying cries about freedom and democracy feel very humorous and ironic, since it is evident early on that Super Earth is actually the villain in this conflict. So, why is it that I'm normally not too into multiplayer games? Well, in the 90s and 2000s, I did play a lot of fast-paced arena-style shooters like Quake 3 Arena, Unreal Tournament 2004, Star Siege, and Star Siege Tribes, but I find that a lot of modern-day multiplayer shooters are too grindy and too dependent on microtransactions, which make the game feel like a pay-to-win casino. Helldivers 2 definitely has its share of microtransactions, but most of it is just mere cosmetic stuff that in no way is necessary in order to enjoy the game, even though it's nice to have. The game starts you off with a basic arsenal, but one of the things that makes the game so great is that every weapon and every ability feels viable, so you will never feel underpowered even if you are new to the game, and it works to your advantage because you don't feel overwhelmed with options right from the beginning. You play the game, you get good with what you have, and then as you play more and more, you'll get access to more interesting and new equipment that gives you new ways to play and enjoy the game. And it doesn't even take that long. Within just 5 to 6 hours of gameplay, you'll get access to things like jetpacks, sniper rifles, flamethrowers, orbital strikes, and even a full-blown mecha that can make you feel overpowered as hell. The way the game works is that it's a 4-player cooperative multiplayer game where you're one of the eponymous Helldivers. What happens is you access the galactic map and you then choose a planet occupied by one of the enemy factions, and then you and your fellow Helldivers get launched down in these bullet-shaped landing pods where you spread gunpoint democracy against your enemies by killing them by the thousands. It reminds me a bit of the Tribes games from the 90s and 2000s because you can choose 3 different armor sets where you have the light armor that is the fastest but most vulnerable, the medium armor, which is the balanced armor, or you can go for the slower, heavier armor. But what makes Helldivers 2 so unique is that you also have access to something called stratagems. What these are support you can call down from your ship that can include basic things like ammo packs and weapons to more advanced things like orbital strikes, mines, and EMP blasts. Some of these attacks can blanket a square kilometer in napalm or poisonous gas, and it makes it easy to get carried away with just how much power is at your fingertips. fingertips. But you have to be careful here, because in Helldivers 2, team kill is always turned on, and it can lead to a lot of hilarious accidental friendly fire deaths against your squad mates. Like, I remember this one time, I was actually defending the dropship that was meant to pick up our team after the mission was done from this wave of incoming automatron enemy forces. So what I did is I threw the stratagem, which was meant to drop a bunch of mines on the battlefield to defend myself from the upcoming waves. But before I threw it, I was killed, so I dropped the automatron gem right on the ground where the dropship was, so it dropped a bunch of mines where all my teammates were, and then everybody got killed and we failed the mission. And then I remember everybody was really pissed off on team chat. They were saying, "Who did that? Who got us all killed?" And I was like saying, "Yeah, who did that? Who's responsible for that?" Of course, I was responsible for that, but nobody figured out it was me. But it's really something when a game manages to be fun, not just when you're winning, but also when you're losing as well. And that's why I absolutely love to play Helldivers, because win or lose, I know I will have a good time. Also, I know recently the developers added a free update to the game that adds another enemy faction to the game called the Illuminids. I haven't played against the Illuminids yet, but now that I've cleared my backlog, I'll likely be doing so soon, and I can't wait. And like I said earlier, this game is really not all that grindy. I got into it about 6 months after the game was launched, and I had no trouble adapting. So anyone who is new to Helldivers 2, they shouldn't hesitate to jump on board, because this is the most multiplayer fun I've had in a game since the days of the PC arena shooters like Unreal and Quake. Although I will say, I do hope that Helldivers 3 lets us play as the Terminids or Automatrons, because it would be funny as hell to see what kind of chaos and drama a PvP fight would have in a game like this. Alright, so those are my 5 runner-ups to my Game of the Year award, and congratulations to all those great games who made it to the list. But as my good friend Duncan MacLeod once told me, there can be only one. Okay, so without further ado, the 2024 Haircafe Game of the Year award goes to Astrobot! Congratulations to Astrobot! So, before I get into all the details about why this game is so great, let me first tell you about how this game personally affected me. This game is marketed as a 30th anniversary celebration of the Sony PlayStation brand. As someone who remembers being a 14-year-old nerdy high school freshman back in 1995, I still recall the day when I was at the mall and walked into the Electronic Boutique, a now defunct gaming store. Initially, I had saved up my money for the Sega Saturn since I had a Sega Genesis, and I am a big Sega fan. But I saw that the Saturn was more expensive than the PlayStation, and I hadn't saved up enough of my allowance money to buy a Saturn. So I went with the PlayStation, a console from a company that hadn't yet proved itself in the gaming community. While I was definitely excited to have the cool new 32-bit gray PlayStation console, part of me was still worried that this would be yet another failed CD entry into the world of video games, much like the Panasonic 3DO or Philips CDI. That rainy day, while my parents drove me back home from the mall while I held my shiny new console in my hands, I never could have imagined how much my life would then change. PlayStation has been part of my life ever since, and I have loved the brand through every gaming generation since. From way back to the PlayStation 1 with games like Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, Metal Gear Solid, and Xenogears, all the way up to modern day games like God of War and Helldivers 2, my fondest gaming memories have all been brought to me by PlayStation. PlayStation is practically written in my DNA. Astrobot doesn't just feel like a celebration of the PlayStation brand, it feels like a warm, heartfelt thank you letter to me on behalf of everyone who ever contributed anything to make PlayStation the gaming juggernaut that it is today. It feels like I am being thanked personally for being a fan for so long and helping make PlayStation happen. So to me, this game isn't just a phenomenal platform, which of course it is. In fact, I'd say this is easily the best platform I've ever played, and it beats out even the best offering from any Nintendo franchise like Mario. So just on its merits as a high quality game, Astrobot is easily one of, if not the best platform games of all time. But the fact that it also invokes so many cherished moments from my gaming past makes me feel like this game is like a digital heaven where PlayStation fans go after they die. At first, you may think this is a kid's game, and sure, kids will definitely love this game, but it doesn't forget about people like me, the older gamers who have been with PlayStation since the very beginning. Throughout the game, you'll rescue fellow Astrobots, many of whom are represented by popular characters from PlayStation's gaming history. But we're not just talking about characters from more recent era of PlayStation games like Aloy from Horizon or Eve from Stellar Blade. The game also pays tribute to many games that existed before the majority of modern-day PlayStation gamers were even born. Like, have you guys ever heard of Alundra, Ark the Lad, Medieval, Gex, Tomba, Croc, Rayman, Suikoden, Wild Arms, and so many more? No, probably not, but I have, and that's the point. Most people who play this game will not be old enough to have played these games back when they were new, and I'm sure the developers knew this fact. So the fact that they included them anyways for people like me who have been around since PlayStation's beginning, I'm not gonna lie, chums, I cried tears of joy. The act of actually playing the game to unlock and see all of these wonderful tributes to my gaming past is a sheer delight, because every level in the game is so full of life and imagination that it makes me, a man in his mid-40s, feel similar to how I felt when I was a kid and I saw Disneyland for the first time. Many of the levels introduce some new gameplay mechanic that Astrobot can wear as a backpack that give him new abilities, like the ability to jump higher, create platforms, or even stop time. None of these feel gimmicky, and they make every level feel like a fun, new, and fresh experience. Additionally, there are some extremely challenging optional levels represented by PlayStation shapes, and some of the later ones are so unforgiving and hard that even the slightest mistake can result in failure, but you never feel it's unfair, and the game is so fun that you'll keep trying over and over again until you finally beat it, even if it takes you 30 attempts to do so. The last level in particular against the game's final boss is so epic that I've already played it over 10 times since I bought the game. I'm not going to spoil it, of course, but without giving away anything, the last battle is basically a culmination of everything you love about PlayStation rallying behind you, the player, because that's who the hero of this game is. It's not the Astrobot character, but rather it's you, because the game is aware that none of these amazing experiences we've enjoyed over the past 30 years would be possible if it weren't for you, the fan who loves PlayStation, and this game loves you back, and you can feel the love in every visible pixel and at every moment of this game, and I love it with all of my heart. This game makes you happy to have spent as much time with PlayStation as you have, and it leaves you optimistic about PlayStation's future. I love PlayStation, and playing this game reminded me that being $50 short to buy a Sega Saturn on that rainy day way back in 1995 was a blessing from God. So, congratulations to Astrobot for winning the 2024 Haircafe Game of the Year award. I'll be back with more hair loss content very soon, but the Haircafe Game of the Year award show is a tradition that started last year, and it is one that I plan to continue annually. So, I will see you all very soon for some more hair loss witchery, and I wish you all a glorious new year for new hair gains and new gaming memories that will stick with you forever. Thank you for watching. God bless.